I'm a 28-year-old woman, and I've been no contact with my mother for nearly a decade, until I got a voicemail last month that changed everything. It came from her neighbor, someone I didn't even know existed, telling me my mother had suffered a stroke and there was no one else. At first, I didn't even recognize the voice. I played the message twice, then deleted it. 2 days later, I was sitting in the hospital room, looking down at the woman who spent years making sure I knew I wasn't wanted. I was born after she had a miscarriage, something traumatic. I don't deny that, but instead of therapy or healing, she treated me like the living reminder of everything she lost. She once told me, when I was 5, that I ruined her life. I remember it clearly. I had spilled juice on the carpet. She didn't just yell. She looked me straight in the eyes and said her marriage wouldn't have fallen apart if I hadn't been born. When I was 8, my father left. He packed his things in the middle of the night and never came back. When people asked, my mother said it was because he couldn't handle raising a difficult child. I didn't ask questions, I already knew it was somehow my fault. That same year, I was diagnosed with chronic asthma. My mother would groan every time I needed to go to the emergency room. She even said once, while driving me to urgent care during an asthma attack, that she should have just left me in the hospital nursery. There was a school trip to a museum when I was 11. I needed a refill on my inhaler that same week. She chose not to buy it, told me to learn to control it. I stayed home. I stopped asking for things after that. Every time the utility bills came in, she'd hold them up in the kitchen like they were awards and say, "You cost more than you'll ever be worth." Birthdays? I didn't have them. I mean, I had the date, but not the celebration. If someone gave me a gift, a neighbor, a teacher, she either returned it or claimed it for herself. There was a doll I got once that I found in her room weeks later, untouched, but out of my reach. She got remarried when I was 14 to a man who pretended I didn't exist. He never said hello, never looked me in the eye. Once, when I was walking past him in the hallway, I heard him mutter that I was just her past life's residue. I didn't understand what that meant then, but I do now. I was the price of her regret. That's all I'd ever been. When I got accepted into the local community college, I printed out the letter and stuck it on the fridge. That night, I found it in the trash. She laughed and told me I was wasting everyone's time, said I'd drop out within a year and come crawling back. I didn't. I worked 2 jobs through high school, one at a fast food chain and the other walking dogs in the neighborhood. I saved every cent, and when I turned 19, I packed up and left. No announcement, no goodbye. Just a note that read, "Don't wait up." For the next 5 years, I couch surfed with classmates, rented the cheapest rooms I could find, and slowly clawed my way into stability. I graduated with a nursing degree, passed my board exams, and got licensed. I didn't tell anyone from my old life. I changed my number, my address, everything. My name stayed the same, but it felt new because no one was using it to hurt me anymore. And then came the voicemail. I didn't go immediately. I waited a day, then another. I told myself I just wanted to see what she looked like now. I don't know what I expected, maybe weakness, maybe fear. What I didn't expect was that same look she always gave me, even now with half her face paralyzed and her body limp from the stroke. The same smirk, the same air of superiority, like time hadn't moved forward at all. She looked at me and said, "With effort, I always knew you'd come crawling back." She sounded smug, like the last 10 years had just been a phase I was destined to outgrow. I stood there for a second, then smiled back and told her, not quite, because I hadn't come back to be her daughter. I had come back to be something else entirely. She was broke. Her second husband had left her 2 years ago. No savings. No family who'd answer her calls. Just me. The daughter she raised to feel like a debt, and now the only one holding the pen on what came next. I signed the hospital forms, arranged for her discharge. Got a lawyer involved? Not because I wanted to help, but because I wanted control. She had made me feel like a mistake for so long. Now, for the first time, I got to choose what she felt. This wasn't forgiveness. This was something colder, sharper, something that felt a lot like justice. I didn't bring her home because I forgave her. I brought her home because no one else would. The hospital gave me 2 options, take her in or sign her over to state care. I told them I'd do it, but only on my terms. A lawyer met us in the hospital room the next morning. She could barely hold the pen, but she managed to scribble her name on the power of attorney documents. Medical, financial, everything came under my control. She didn't even read them. She just stared straight ahead while the lawyer explained each section, nodding occasionally. At home, I wheeled her inside and parked her in the living room. The TV was already on. She tried to ask how to change the channel, but I made her wait until the show was over. It was a drama series she'd once called trashy when I was a teenager. Now it played every afternoon, and she had to sit through it, eyes glued to the screen, no remote in reach. Her room was already ready. Pastel pink walls, frilly curtains, throw pillows with glitter unicorns. I even swapped out the ceiling light with one that projected stars in rainbow colors. The sheets were cartoon-themed. She used to say pink was for weak girls. Now her world was dipped in it. She looked around and didn't say a word. I closed the door behind her without asking if she liked it. Meals were simple. Soup, mashed vegetables. I served them in plastic bowls with cartoon characters printed on the sides. Every time I placed the tray in front of her, I reminded her that the burden she once sighed about now made her food. She didn't look up. Her shampoo ran out on day 3. I replaced it with a baby formula brand, labeled mild for delicate hair. I didn't even try to hide it. I set it right beside her sink, next to a pink toothbrush shaped like a dolphin. She stared at it like it might bite her. She once wrote pages about me in a diary I found in a sealed box in her closet. I read one entry a night while she sat in bed. I didn't change a word. I read how she felt cursed the day I was born, how she used to cry in the shower after school meetings because she was trapped with a child she didn't ask for. Her expression stayed blank the first few nights. Stephen. On the 5th night, she told me to stop. I didn't. I made her a daily schedule. Wake up at 7:00 a.m., bed made by 7:30, breakfast at 8:00, morning pills at 8:15, bathroom break at 8:30. and so on. She wasn't capable of doing all those things alone, so I reminded her of every task like I was her supervisor. I pinned the schedule to the wall above her bed. It had a sticker chart, smiley faces for good behavior, frowns when she snapped at me. She called me a monster on the 7th day. I nodded and said, "I learned from the best." Then I played my graduation speech on loop from my phone, the one she never came to. I'd recorded it years ago when my friend's father held up her phone in the front row for me. Every morning, it played while she ate breakfast. Neighbors started to ask questions. They saw me walking her in the garden or wheeling her down the driveway. I always smiled and said, "She's lucky her daughter forgave her." They smiled back, not knowing a thing. I made sure every nurse visit was scheduled when I was home. I listened closely. I watched her expression when her past was mentioned. She tried to speak carefully, but I controlled the conversations. No lies allowed. One morning, she asked if she'd walk again. I said she could if she admitted she was wrong. If she admitted I was never a burden. She looked away. I didn't push. I just wheeled her to her spot by the window, facing the blank wall, and left her there for the rest of the evening. I installed child locks on her wheelchair brakes. I told her it was for safety. She didn't question it, just sat there in silence. She used to control every inch of my life, my outfits, my food, my friends. Now she couldn't move an inch without my help. At night, I'd sometimes hear her crying softly. I didn't ask why. Instead, I printed out my old report cards, the ones she used to tear up. I pinned them on the fridge. I placed my nursing license beside her bed in a clear frame. When she asked for something, anything, I made her ask properly. Full sentence. Please and thank you. She once refused and waited 6 hours for me to hand her the television remote. After that, she never skipped the words again. By the end of week 2, she stopped trying to protest. She followed the schedule, ate what I gave, watched what I watched, sat where I placed her. She stopped asking when she could leave. She had no one else. No friends, no visits, just me. And I wasn't her daughter. I was the cost, the receipt, the living proof that debts don't always go unpaid. The first change I made was the mirror, a full-length one, placed directly across from her bed. It wasn't subtle. Every morning when she opened her eyes, the first thing she saw was her reflection, her frail, hollow frame, her immobile arm, her tired eyes. She had no choice but to look at what time, choices, and bitterness had done. I didn't say anything about it. I just positioned her bed slightly to the left so it lined up perfectly. Above her headboard, I framed the full hospital bill from her stroke recovery, itemized, paid in full, with my name on the receipt. I used a silver frame, polished clean. Every nurse who came in saw it. She tried to cover it with a towel once. I removed the towel without a word and taped the corners down. At noon each day, I wheeled her out into the front garden. There was a park across the street. Children played there every day after school. Swings creaked. Laughter carried. She watched them through the iron bars. I sat beside her and told her how I used to dream of playing like that, but never got to. Not once. I made sure to point out the kids running toward their parents with ice cream, their shoes muddy, faces messy. She never said anything. She just watched. I stopped hiding the painkillers after that first week. I kept them in a see-through container on the kitchen shelf. When she needed them, she had to ask. Not just ask politely. I waited for her to use the right tone, full sentence, and say thank you. If she skipped any part, I walked away. She got the hang of it by day 4. For breakfast, I added a new tradition. I dug up old video files from a thumb drive I hadn't touched in years. They were recordings of childhood birthdays, except mine were just clips of empty rooms, kids celebrating without me, or a silent screen where the recorder had forgotten to press play. One video showed me sitting alone with a cupcake while voices laughed in the background. Every morning, she watched one while she ate toast and soft fruit. Under her bed, I hid a small Bluetooth speaker. At random intervals, it played soft lullabies, the kind she used to scoff at, calling them pathetic and childish. She once called me weak for singing one to myself after a nightmare. Now they played low and steady, especially at night, just loud enough to keep her awake. Her favorite blanket disappeared one afternoon. I replaced it with a coarse, scratchy one. The same kind I had as a kid when she told me only good kids got comfort. I watched her try to smooth it out, tried to find a corner that didn't itch. She gave up eventually and folded it at the foot of the bed. When I was 15, she slapped me across the face for crying after failing a test. Now I walked past her chair, stopped suddenly, and let tears roll down my cheeks on cue. I practiced until it looked real. She would shift, fidget, murmur for me to stop. One night she said, "Enough," and I turned away, still crying. I invited over an old childhood friend, someone whose mother once told mine she wished she could adopt me. We sat in the kitchen while my mother sat nearby, listening. We talked about the good memories that never happened, what life might have looked like if things were different. Her mother had offered me a place once. My mother said no. My friend remembered everything. At the end of every day, I left a printed hourly log on her bedside table. A list of every task I did, medication at 9:00, changed sheets at 10:30, fed lunch at noon, and so on. It was signed off by me, with the note, unpaid labor, or provided by the one you didn't want. She once asked for a priest to visit. I agreed, and brought in a therapist instead. The therapist introduced herself calmly and asked about my mother's childhood. My mother sat frozen, unsure whether to engage. After 10 minutes, she asked the therapist to leave. I handed her a flyer about grief counseling. In her old drawers, I found letters from my school, reports, teacher comments, attendance awards. Most had been crumpled or torn. I read them aloud after dinner. Then I asked her to rate them on a scale of 1 to 10. She didn't answer the first time. The second time, she said, 7. I marked it down on the back of the letter and tacked it to her door. She dropped a spoon during lunch. It hit the tile and rolled under the cabinet. She looked at me. I looked back. I didn't move. She asked quietly. I waited. A full hour passed before I picked it up and placed it on the counter, without washing it. That night, just before sleep, she whispered from her bed, "Why are you doing this?" I stood in the doorway and said, "Because I can." I turned off the lights. closed the door, and wrote a note in my planner that said, "This isn't revenge. This is memory." It was only the second chapter of what she owed me. The first thing I brought home that week was a whiteboard. I wrote "things you never did for me" at the top in permanent marker and leaned it against the foot of her bed. I left the rest of it blank. No instructions, no reminders, just white space. She looked at it every morning while I changed her sheets and said nothing. It stayed there for days, untouched. I upgraded the lights in the house to voice control, except I was the only one with access to the system. Every evening when the sun went down, the living room dim. She had to ask me to turn them on. I didn't always respond right away. Sometimes I waited 5 minutes, sometimes 10. She never complained more than once. One day she asked if she could read something, anything. I handed her a worn parenting manual I found at a thrift store. It had notes and dog-eared pages already, but I added bookmarks of my own. Chapters titled "The Long-Term Effects of Emotional Neglect" and "How to Love a Child You Resent." She held it in her lap, fingers twitching at the cover. I checked back an hour later. The book hadn't moved. A local charity reached out through my job and asked if I had a photo for their Caregiver Spotlight series. I sent in one from our garden. I was smiling in the foreground, crouched beside some flowers. She was in the background, face twisted mid-sentence. They published it in the monthly newsletter. I left a copy on the kitchen counter. Later that week, I went through the hallway closet and pulled out a box of her old photo albums. I made collages with the pictures she smiled in, every single one where I wasn't present. Family vacations I never went on. Birthdays I wasn't invited to. Smiling faces, holidays, hugs with relatives I'd only seen once. I taped the collages to the inside of her closet door. She opened it the next morning and just stared. That afternoon, she asked why I was doing all of this. I reminded her. She told me once I'd never become anything, that I was a drain, a weight, a mistake. I told her I was just proving her wrong, one controlled breath at a time. While cleaning, I found her will in a folder tucked behind the couch cushions. The old version left everything, what little she had, to distant cousins and a local church. I rewrote it with her consent, standing beside her with 2 witnesses while she signed. Everything went to me now. Property, insurance, the dusty coin collection in the basement. She didn't ask questions, just signed with a trembling hand. A coworker once asked why I was doing all this. I told them, because this time she can't walk away. That answer seemed to settle it. I recreated my childhood bedroom in the guest room. I remembered every detail, the cheap mattress that dipped in the middle, the peeling paint on one wall, the single flickering light bulb that buzzed overhead. I made her sleep in it for one night. When I woke her up the next morning, she asked if she could go back to her room with the memory foam mattress. I told her, after you bring back my childhood, steal. She didn't answer. One evening while brushing her hair, I asked if she remembered throwing out my drawings when I was 8. She looked confused at first, then said she didn't recall. I told her to apologize anyway. She muttered something soft. I asked her to say it louder. She did. I nodded and continued brushing. I hosted a small get-together that weekend. A few friends, some coworkers. She asked to join us in the living room. I said sure, and gave her a tray of snacks to serve. She rolled slowly between conversations, placing bowls of chips and small plates of cookies on tables. No one addressed her directly. When she tried to speak, I shook my head. She stopped. Later, she called me cruel. I leaned in close and asked if it was crueler than telling a 7-year-old she should have died in the womb. She didn't say anything after that. I had old voice memos saved on an ancient phone I'd long forgotten. It's recordings from the house back when I was still living under her roof. One captured a fight we had when I was 12. Another when I was 16 and begged to stay with a friend for the weekend. Each one ended with her yelling, wishing I'd never been born. I played them back one by one while we sat at the dinner table. I didn't explain. I didn't have to. That night, she called me by my full name, first and last. The first time she'd said it since I moved out. Her voice cracked when she said she was sorry. I stood still in the doorway. Then I turned off the light without replying and went to bed. I didn't want her apology. I just wanted her to understand what it meant to mean nothing, because that's what she gave me to grow up with. And we weren't even halfway done. I told her I was going on a trip, packed a small bag, left a note on the fridge, and arranged for a licensed caregiver to come by each morning. But I never left. I stayed in the guest room with the door cracked, listening through the vents. The caregiver was kind, firm, but gentle. She didn't coddle. She followed the care instructions but added her own touch, fresh flowers, soft music, occasional conversation that didn't circle back to guilt. Before her first shift, I told her something very specific. If she asks for anything unreasonable, say no. You're allowed. That sentence must have stunned my mother. No one in my childhood was ever allowed to say no to her. On the 3rd night, just after midnight, I heard her crying softly. Not the dramatic kind, the quiet, raw kind you don't expect from someone who spent their life holding power over others. Between sniffles, she muttered, "I don't want to be like this anymore." The words floated through the vent and hit me like a bell that wasn't supposed to ring. The next morning, I printed a letter and slid it under her door. It was written as if from a social worker offering free emotional support services for stroke survivors. I created a separate number, routed through a call forwarding app, and waited. Later that evening, I watched from the hallway as she stared at the letter for over an hour. Then she called. I answered with a calm voice, pretending to be someone else. She asked if she could talk. Said she wasn't sure what was happening with her daughter. Said she felt like everything was slipping. Then she paused and said, "I think she hates me." Maybe she always did. I didn't reply for a few seconds. Then I asked, "Why does that matter to you now?" She hung up. I waited until the next morning to walk into her room. I sat in the chair by the window and asked again, this time as myself, "Why does it matter now if I hate you?" She looked away, then down. Her hands trembled as she picked at the edge of her blanket. She said she didn't know how to love someone who reminded her of everything she lost. I stayed silent. Then I asked, "So I was your punishment for grief?" She didn't respond, just stared at her lap. I played a recording from a real therapist I had met during my volunteer hours. It was a session where the therapist explained how generational trauma works. how pain passes like inheritance when it goes untreated. I left the recording playing while I stepped out. When I came back, she looked pale, but different. Like something had been broken, not physically, but structurally. That same afternoon, I got a letter in the mail from the nursing board. A formal thank you for my volunteer work with post-stroke patients. I placed it on the kitchen table without a word. She saw it later that night and didn't say anything. She just stared at it for a long time before wheeling herself back to her room. 2 days later, I left the front door unlocked. I went to a friend's place nearby, turned off my phone, and waited. Hours passed. When I returned, she was sitting in the hallway in her chair, staring at the door. She looked at me and didn't ask where I'd gone. She just whispered, "I thought you left." I nodded and said, "Scary, right? Not knowing if someone who takes care of you will come back?" She looked away. The shift started after that. She started asking questions, real ones. It's about my life, my job, what kind of patients I worked with, what my friends were like. She asked what I did on weekends, what music I liked now. She asked what kind of apartment I lived in before moving back. I answered her, briefly, nothing deep. One night, we sat in the living room with the lights dimmed. She asked if I ever thought about studying abroad. I told her I once got a scholarship offer out of state, but didn't take it because she told me I wasn't good enough. She went quiet. Then she whispered, "You were always more than enough." I stared at her for a long time before replying. "And then why did you wait until you needed me to say it?" She didn't answer. Not right away. And I didn't ask again. Something had cracked, not healed, just cracked. And for the first time in my entire life, she didn't pretend it wasn't her fault. I started stepping back. Not completely, just enough to shift the weight. I told her she'd be attending a support group once a week. It was for caregivers and parents who had become estranged from their children. The facility offered transportation, and I made sure she was ready every Thursday afternoon. I sat in the back row during the first session, out of her line of sight. In the second half of the session, each participant shared something personal. When her turn came, she paused for a long time. Then she said, "I failed her, and I used her." No excuses, no disclaimers, just that. A woman across the room snapped, asked how many decades she thought she could erase with a single confession. My mother didn't respond, but her chin trembled, and for the first time in my life, I saw her cry in front of other people. A few days later, she asked if we could go for a drive. No purpose, no errands, just a drive. We'd never done that before. I helped her into the passenger seat and drove to the pier. I parked facing the ocean and rolled down the windows. Seagulls circled above. Boats drifted. She didn't say a word for almost an hour, just watched the water. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet. "I don't deserve to be forgiven." I didn't argue. I just said, "That's not your choice to make." Back at home, she asked about a drawing I made when I was a child. She remembered it, a crayon sketch of a garden, labeled with my name in shaky letters. She had thrown it away when I was 7. I had found it years later, torn but still recognizable, and kept it. I went to my desk, folded it gently, and handed it to her without comment. Later that week, I heard a thump from her room. I rushed in and found her on the floor. She had tried to stand on her own. Her legs had given out. I didn't ask why she tried. I helped her up without a word, adjusted her pillows, and left a note beside her bed that night. It read, "Helping you doesn't erase what happened. It just reminds me who I am now." My aunt stopped by the following day. She hadn't visited in years but had heard about my mother's condition. After an awkward start, she sat across from her and said, "I always thought you didn't know what you had." My mother didn't argue. She looked down at her lap and nodded once. That evening, I gave her back her favorite blanket, the one I had taken away weeks ago. It was washed, folded, and placed neatly at the end of her bed. I told her it was a loan, not a gift. She nodded again and smoothed it out over her knees. The next morning at breakfast, I asked if she wanted to choose the music. It was the first time I'd offered. She thought for a while, then requested a lullaby, one of the ones she used to mock. I played it through the speakers while we ate. Later that afternoon, she asked if she could meet my boyfriend. I told her, maybe one day, but not because you're family, because you'll have earned it. She didn't push. She just nodded and went quiet again. A neighbor saw me walking down the driveway and waved. She asked if we were on good terms now. I didn't pause before answering. There are no terms, just history. The neighbor smiled politely. My mother stayed silent. That night, while I was tucking her in, she looked up at me and said, "If I could start over, I'd do everything differently." I pulled the blanket up to her chest, fluffed her pillow, and said, "You can start by being honest tomorrow." I turned off the light, closed the door, and let the silence settle for once, without forcing it. There was no neat ending, no forgiveness speech. But something in the air was different, thinner, less sharp. Like the static was fading. I wasn't rebuilding anything, just watching what remained when the shouting stopped. I found the letter on the kitchen table just before sunrise. The paper was wrinkled, the handwriting jagged and uneven. At the top, she'd written, "I was a coward. I know that now." The rest of the letter was short. She admitted that she hadn't failed because I wasn't good enough. She failed because she wasn't. She wrote that she saw me clearly now, not as a mistake, but as someone she was never equipped to love. She ended with, "You deserve a mother." I wish I had been one. I read it twice, folded it carefully, and placed it in the back of my drawer without a word. That same afternoon, I told her I was leaving for a while. Just a week. No guests. No calls. I arranged a temporary stay at a nearby post-stroke care center that came recommended by one of my colleagues. The room was private. The staff was fully trained. Everything was paid for in advance. She asked only one question, "Will you come back?" I looked at her and said, "I haven't decided yet." I packed a small bag, got in my car, and drove 5 hours north to a quiet lakeside cabin. No television. No distractions. just water, silence, and a wooden dock that creaked under my steps. Each night, I sat there with a blanket around my shoulders, watching the ripples stretch across the surface. I didn't make plans. I didn't make lists. I just sat and let the noise from the past few years drain out. On the fourth night, I saw a missed call from the care facility, then a voicemail. Her caseworker said she had stopped eating. She was refusing her therapy exercises. She told the staff she didn't want to waste anyone's time anymore. I didn't call back. I needed to know whether she meant it, whether this was her choice or just another version of the game where I was supposed to fix what she broke. When I came back at the end of the week, she looked different, thinner, eyes sunken, hands more fragile, but she didn't cry. She looked at me and said, "I thought about you every day." I walked to the window, opened the curtain, and asked, "Did you think about who I used to be when you told that girl she ruined your life?" She nodded, then said, "I see her now. I mourn her, and I hope she haunts me." That night, after I helped her to bed, I sat at the dining table with a pen and a single sheet of paper. No dramatic speeches, no accusations, just what needed to be said. I wrote about what it meant to grow up carrying someone else's bitterness. I wrote that healing doesn't mean staying, that forgiveness doesn't guarantee reunion, and I wrote that being needed is not the same as being loved. I folded the letter neatly and tucked it into my bag for the morning. When the sun rose, I helped her brush her hair. I brought her breakfast, but she only managed a few bites. I adjusted the pillow behind her back and placed the letter on her lap. I didn't say anything. I picked up my bag and walked to the door. As I reached for the handle, I heard her voice behind me. Weak, but clear. "Will I ever see you again?" I didn't turn around. I said, "You already did, and you waste it." Then I left. And this time, I didn't leave a note.